So thank you again for joining us. And I'm now going to introduce Isaac, who is a professional trail builder and amateur socialist. I wouldn't say that. I would say a pretty professional socialist. He is a member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union, AFSCME DC37, and Cityworkers for Palestine, and tries his best to practice independent socialist politics in both. In NYC-DSA, he is involved in the Independent Working Class Organizing Initiative, where he helps build and strengthen tenant organization across the city. He's also a member of the Marxist Unity Group and once had his drill taken by Eric Adams. So please help me welcome Isaac.
So today I'm here to talk about a specific union, one that I think basically not many people have heard of. I assume I didn't know about it until I did this research, really, and I assume most people in the room don't know, and I would argue that's intentional. It's the United Public Workers of America, which is it was like the CIO's public sector worker union. It represented teachers, welfare workers, parks department workers, much like the public sector unions today, like AFSCME DC37, my fine and fair union. But this was in the 30s and 40s, and I think the story of the union also tells a story of the kinds of organizing that was going on, how the left shifted over those years, and also the massive effects of the Red Scare, as well as a kind of missing link of social or community unionism. But first, I want to start in the present day, as I like to do, with a thing that makes next slide, please. A thing that makes me go, So at a union meeting a few months ago, we were just talking about things. The president was going and doing his dramatic monologue for us on the different things going on. And he kind of mentioned, of course, we've always been opposed to closing Rikers. And so me and my fellow delegates were like, huh? So so one of them went up and asked okay, did you say you were opposed to closing Rikers? I just wanted to get some clarity on that. And he was like, yeah, we're totally opposed to closing Rikers. We want Rikers to stay open. And so that made me go, because, I wanted to know, okay, why are we set up in opposition to our broader class, right? Why is it that the people who grow up in the same communities are often pitted against each other in these in our workplaces, the kind of worker to client relationship, as well as just in the unions. There's this kind of dual edge sword of city worker consciousness, where we're really aware that we're kind of getting a raw deal from the city, but oftentimes the one thing we really want to agitate for is more cops and kind of just stronger carceral means. And I think it's a big story of New York public sector unions since the 70s is kind of inability to combat austerity effectively. So that made me go, So I wanted to check, did any other union do this better than mine? And I found out there's this stolen history of 1930s to 1950s or so public sector unions. These were incredibly large unions that represented teachers, park workers, sanitation department, everyone, right? And it was also the site of the longest lasting political persecution in the history of American public education. Around 400 teachers lost their jobs in the late 40s to early 50s, along with scores of public sector unionists across agencies and across the U.S. And when you lose your job in public sector, right, you lose benefits, you lose an identity, you lose your pension. A lot of these people were unable to go back to the profession that they loved and were very, very good at until some of them were reinstated in the late 60s to 80s. Some people started receiving pension checks on their near their deathbed in the 2000s. The effects of the Red Scare went on so long. There's an article written about in the New York Times in 2009 about how it's this long-lasting scar in these families. This union really emphasized, much like a lot of the left-led unions in the CIO, a kind of social unionism. Today it's often called bargaining for the common good, but it essentially says, emphasizes building up connections between your workplace and your community. So the Chicago Teachers Union nowadays famously will advocate for things that benefit not just themselves as teachers, but the whole school. So they advocate for things like social workers in every school. They also advocate against school closures. They advocate for affordable housing and play a very large political role in the city. Another vibe of like public sector unionism is a kind of professionalism. We're here because we want to be honored as professionals. We're not treated as like kind of experts the same way that like other people are, and we want some respect and honor. And you know, there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's the union I'm talking about was founded by high school teachers that you know, weren't getting the, you know, were brilliant people, but you know, were kind of seen as like not equal to being like an academic at a prestigious university. So two big questions that come up in my study are this question of democracy. What does democracy mean? Why are these people talking about democracy so much? And is this history like a missing link, or is it this living alternative? Is there stuff we could bring forward from this, or is this a path we can't go on again? Okay. I'm going to play it.
I have to tell you, as Sam has reminded me,
Okay.
we'll have Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson, who are here with us. And I will tell you a story about Eli.
Should we restart on the?
Yeah, let me.
Wallach.
1 second.
I'm sorry, I did not. Okay, there we go.
Sam has reminded me. We'll have Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson, who are here
Close
with
enough.
us. And I will tell you a story about Eli Wallach that Sam Wallach tells, okay? Before we break, how many of you stood before,
Mid-2000s.
if you were members of the teachers union, how many of you were substitutes? All right, then you would appreciate this song. This is called The Lament of a Substitute, and it's based on a song written by Robert Mirapole's father, Lewis Allen, and Earl Robinson.
I'm ahead.
Do folks know who the Mirapoles were? So they probably best known for both like kind of adopting the children of the Rosenbergs, but also wrote the song "Strange Fruit." And one of them was a public school teacher and wrote this song, which I think is a great union song about being a substitute teacher.
And Earl Robinson. What is a substitute to me? A name, a job, a mockery, a certain word, poverty. That is a substitute to me. The school I teach in, the children side by side, still going to the same school where their grandpas lived and died. The little church I pray in for each maternity, and a new job each semester, that's a substitute to me. The class I teach at, 40 students strong, 3 kids sitting in each seat, and the benches ain't too long. The salary they pay me with no vacations free, and the teaching on a license, that's a substitute to me. No pay for Lincoln's birthday, for Washington the same, for Armistice, Thanksgiving, and the others I could name. A board that won't appoint me in spite of all my tears, and a list that I have been on for 10 or 15 years. The teachers union, the best damn friend I've got, where teachers get together and learn what the hell is what. For jobs for all the teachers, for schools that could be free, for a people's education, it's the union that's for me.
Sorry. All right. Okay. So the New York Teachers Union, it was started in 1916 by like two old guard socialists, kind of like old school Debs types. And at the start, around this time, public sector unions, they're like professional associations. If you ever wondered why the Policemen's Benevolent Association is called that when they're not very benevolent, it's because it wasn't a union at the time. It was this kind of like fraternal club. And that's basically what they thought of themselves as, this teachers union. They kind of believed in this like strong professional code and cooperating with management to improve the craft of teaching. And they only really allowed full-time teachers to be members. It was, you know, we're the elite, we're the cream of the crop here. If remember the song we just heard, right? There's also around the time of the 20s to 30s, the Great Depression, there's this, I think, like we're seeing today in public sector work, a great kind of casualization of work. There's a lot more substitute teachers. There's teachers who are employed by the WPA, not by the Board of Ed, but also teaching in the same classrooms. And none of these people were really allowed in the teachers union at the time. So communists in the teachers union formed this group called the Rank and File Caucus, which really emphasizes a different approach. They emphasize under like a really, really militant approach, being vigorous fighters for the whole class, where on the other hand, the professional teachers union, they were kind of, okay, like let's work with the mayor and figure out a good deal because we're really cutting back and we all have to do our part. They focused on the class nature of administration, right? Like they're not just our bosses, they're capitalists, and that really matters. And they really emphasized a kind of mass action approach where they would fight for the whole community and whole class and really work to agitate to expand the union. This was a time in the history of the Communist Party called the Third Period. Third period politics are kind of when this across the world really far left-wing turn happens, where they start to emphasize the differences between themselves and social democrats, who they call social fascists. There's a lot of drawbacks of this period. Oftentimes they would end in these kind of petty fights that didn't really have to do with like the specific like on the ground conditions. They would kind of split just to split. Oftentimes it's depicted as this kind of raving, senseless period of ultra leftism. But there are some real innovations. Around this time, because part of this third period policy is forming independent unions, the communists across the U.S. formed these independent industrial unions in something called the Trade Union Unity League. And they push for a different approach to unionism, like a visibly different approach to unionism. So they kind of are push themselves to think about how they could really act differently. And in public sector unions, and at the time, like private sector unions, there's very little contracts. Public sector union contracts don't really happen until like the 50s or 60s. There really isn't a right to collective bargaining. So this innovative, like kind of agitational approach really does kind of make some sense for public sector unions, because at the time they're minority unions. They only really represent a minority of the workplace, and they have to be really vigorous at their job because they don't have any formal rights. And it kind of edges on this community or social unionism. So there's some interesting feuds if you're like a left-wing history nerd, like I am. Jay Lovestone is in this group and then forms his own group of like a rival teacher union faction that's also opposed. But I'm going to read this quote from this book that we read, Reds in the Classroom. Although the left factions in the teachers union were often at odds, a major battle in the teachers union was between the rank and file and the leadership. The leadership emphasized professionalism, collaboration with management, and legislation as a way of improving the working conditions for teachers. The more left-leaning teachers critical of the leadership advocated a more militant program. They did not view teachers as professionals, but as members of the industrial working class whose major objective was to take part in the struggle against capitalism. capital. The Board of Education was not seen as a neutral body, but as pro-capital, taking part in the exploitation of workers. So I think while they would oftentimes use a lot of blue language to describe these things, they're getting at like a really important truth about how the state works. It's this interesting double bind we're in working in the public sector is like, we really want to be good at our job and we provide important services like teaching. Can you imagine a more noble profession? But also, it belongs to the capitalist state, and oftentimes our leadership or administration has some vested interest in pursuing political ideological goals. It's a kind of cliche. There's this line of like schools are like prisons, like everything else. But there's some real truth to it, as anyone who attended a U.S. history class can attest to. So around the time, and there's a long fight in throughout the 30s over this, and eventually they take charge in around 1935, and they really transform from like this kind of closed off guild to a bigger industrial union. An example of this, they renamed the paper from Union Teacher to New York Teacher News. They're trying to speak for all teachers, including substitutes, private schools, parochial schools, and so on. And they start to press not just for higher wages and reduced classroom sizes, but also things like what they called intercultural education, or you might call like ethnic studies these days, and removing racist textbooks. They organize alongside parent committees, the American Labor Party, and other unions. Around this time, they're forming what's known as the Popular Front, and there's all these other kind of organizations in the orbit of the left in the U.S. And the teachers union really sees this as an opportunity to build a kind of strong community support for their demands. So they oftentimes organize alongside things like, neighborhood committees, parent-teacher associations, other unions. They write that an organization like theirs cannot confine itself to a narrow line of economic activity only. Teachers, like other humans, do not live by bread alone. And they start forming these things like public talks, continuing ed events. They have something called the Franz Boas Workshop, who is a kind of very famous anthropologist who was really opposed to the scientific racism that was prevalent at the time, and would kind of do public workshops for teachers union and surrounding community, essentially debunking the scientific racist myths that were still present at the time. Around this time, there's this move in the broader trade union movement to form a new union called the CIO, or originally the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It emphasizes industrial unionism as opposed to the craft unionism that existed beforehand. Around this time, they're expelled from the AFT. They had been a kind of thorn in the side for a minute, and they always had their foes. But in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is formed, and the communists in this union really pushed the union to kind of change course and where they're going, and much like the rest of the Communist Party, take this position of like, whoa, well, let's not be so hasty into going into war right now. Whereas before they were like, we need to strike back. Now when the Soviet Union kind of formed this terrible like peace with Hitler, they kind of started mollifying their position, and it was a real moment of weakness, I think, and a real mistake of trying to like put forward these like international politics. Just kind of wherever they were, and was a real stain on the mark, and was I would opportunistically used to expel them from the AFT, but they joined the CIO and kind of come back into the fold in the 40s. So it's still a minority union this whole time. There's no collective bargaining. The Board of Ed is opposed to their existence fundamentally, so they really do have to get creative, and that's, I think, where a lot of this like creativity comes from. But around the time of immediately after the war, it was the status quo during the war, and then suddenly there really starts to be a real pushback against the left. There's a massive strike wave in 1946, and it seems like there's a real battle for how society and industry will be shaped in America. And labor kind of loses that battle, and there starts to be this massive Cold War going on. And I think really interestingly and under discussed, the teachers are really some of the first victims in this. So I'm going to read from this book, The Cold War Against Labor. This is a true story in 1948 of when the Red Scare really starts to hit in the teachers union. In December 1948, 2 days before the Christmas holidays, two inquisitors traveled by train and ferry to a Staten Island elementary school. A severe snowstorm was raging, but they were sent by New York City school superintendent William Jansen, and they had a job to do. The weather did not deter them. They summoned Mrs. Minnie Guttreed from her first grade classroom with no prior notification. They proceeded to question her about meetings she allegedly attended 7 or 8 years earlier. Confronted suddenly by the two interrogators and a recording secretary, Mrs. Guttreed requested the right to consult a lawyer. They immediately threatened to charge her with conduct unbecoming a teacher. She left school frightened and shaken. Minnie Guttreed lived alone. Her husband had gone to Spain in the 1930s to defend the fragile new democratic government against Franco-fascism. He fought with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade of the International Brigade and gave his life in that cause. In the ensuing years, Mrs. Guttreed had become a staunch member of the New York City Teachers Union, although she taught in an area where the union was weak. Now, alone in her home, she went over and over the events of the day. She could see no viable alternatives. Minnie Guttreed committed suicide that lonely night in 1948. When her body was found the next morning, shockwaves spread through the public, not only at the questioning of Mrs. Guttreed, but the brutality of the board's procedure. For its opening gun in a long campaign to destroy the teachers union, the Board of Education had chosen a spot where they expected the least resistance. And this becomes a big cause celeb at the time, but the Board of Education doesn't really take a step back. They even blame the teachers union for this woman's suicide. They say they had it was their fault. They had created this kind of climate of fear and exaggerated things, which is why she committed suicide, which is the monstrous thing to say. I'm sure we can maybe think of echoes today with the persecutions of students and faculty for supporting Palestine. So I'm going to play a video of an interview with a teacher who kind of describes these interrogations that would happen.
It was after the board saw that I couldn't be dismissed without trial that I was then called for questioning by Superintendent Perch, who was the associate superintendent in charge of the secondary schools. And I refused to answer the question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, on the grounds that he was violating the Civil Service Law, Section 103, I think it is, which forbade him to ask any such question. I told him I would be glad to answer any questions about my professional activity. Then, ultimately, I was suspended for refusing to answer the question and brought to trial before the Board of Education. And all that the attorney for the board had to do was prove that I had been asked a question and had refused to answer it. And this was sufficient for them to establish that I had committed insubordination and conduct unbecoming a teacher. And I was dismissed. This was the kind of Alice in Wonderland logic that was used.
So around 400 people were dismissed or forced to resign or retired along this line, and it often very similar interrogations, confront with materials found in their classroom, confront with materials made by undercover cops, by informers of you were associated with the Communist Party in some way, not just being a member, but just attending any one of these kind of Popular Front organizations that would happen in the time. And it was leading up to declaring the teachers union itself a kind of criminal enterprise led by the Communist Party. And, in the HUAC hearings, famously people would plead the fifth. Here, they used that against them, and they had this trick where they essentially goaded people into pleading the fifth and then saying, by not answering our questions directly, that's insubordination, therefore I can fire you. And 400 around 1,100 members were interrogated, and 400 people's lives were ruined by this. It destroyed a model of community teacher coalitions, a model that tied the teachers' welfare to the communities they served. There's evidence that the cops start spying in the mid 30s or so, because they're coming back when, like, the Board of Education says, hey, can you give us notes on this person? And they say, here's, a giant stack of papers, but maybe only use the first few pages because we don't want to let them know where we got all of this from. But the crackdown really hits as the mayor of New York, O'Dwyer, he starts to turn on the left and kind of shore up his base with Irish Catholics, and appoints this guy Timon to the Board of Education, who's really this like far right nutball. He kind of reminds me of maybe like Christopher Rufo or some of those guys today. He bans books. He was like, really chummy with followers of Father Coughlin in the early 40s, though he would always say like, well, I attended those meetings, but I was never a formal member, which, I think I'll say is a little BS. It starts with a teacher discussing debates in the UN, and the principal basically says, hang on, there's an issue here. You're kind of trying to present this as a neutral, but we all should side with the U.S. in these debates over, I think it was whether the Soviet Union being nuclear armed was a good thing or not. This is kind of picked up by this guy Timon. He kind of sees these notes and really starts seizing on this idea of like these communists are foreign agents trying to bring our kids over to totalitarianism. The objectivity in this situation is un-American. We have to always side with the U.S. He starts asking principals to make lists, which oftentimes they're more than willing to do because they want the union off their hair. He creates something called the Committee to Strengthen Democracy. If you ever create a committee to strengthen democracy, it's probably a bad thing in U.S. history. So I think like a lot of times your right lies just like us, both on a kind of bureaucratic arm and an organizer arm. In this case, there's this kind of mini fascist on the board, Timon, who builds this coalition of Catholics, cops, informers, oftentimes working together. There's a case where someone says, it's a cop comes up to him and says, can you get my sister a job at a parochial school, please? And here, I'll give you these papers in exchange. The teachers union organizes huge crowds to resist this. They really make clear that this is an existential threat. They outnumber them. They go to all the public hearings. I'm sure you've been at hearings like this. They have 100 people there. The opposition has 5 nutballs, and they still lose. It's not enough. This bureaucratic guy Jansen, he's this kind of racist asshole bureaucrat who's on there. He's very good at making lists. He's very determined to root people out. They really dedicate themselves to this task of thoroughly dismissing the union, and eventually pass the Timon resolution, which declares it just, an illegal organization.
Get out. Go. Not going to get anything. Go away.
So I'm going to...
Go away. No.
Okay, so they the state passes something called the Feinberg Law. That essentially allows them to just fire all teachers who they are even associated with the Communist Party. This is also an attempt to really reshape education. The Teachers Union makes a lot of note that Jansen writes a lot of really racist textbooks. They even have a whole pamphlet they put out of how to identify racist textbooks, and points out that very frequently it's this guy Jansen who's written all these like kind of awful scientific racist textbooks about geography and so on. It's clearly an attempt not just to kick the union out, but also really reshape this kind of social education they were doing. In some cases, cops will kind of pull people in to be questioned with the supervisor just because they're teaching about things like Reconstruction, teaching about lynchings. They say, hey, look, the Soviet Union keeps on talking about how the U.S. is doing these terrible things. Where are you getting this information from here? So eventually they declare this a instrument of the Communist Party, not a union, and they bar the union from representation, from filing grievances, even from being publicly acknowledged by the board. And I'm just going to read out the Timon resolution, which I think it's just important to like think about how just anti-democratic and authoritarian that they were doing it. Like they had undercover cops in most schools, like spying on teachers' papers, and in some cases gave people like thousands of dollars to inform on their coworkers. So whereas Teachers Union Local 555 United Public Workers is not a bona fide professional or labor organization and has been expelled from responsible professional and labor groups upon the ground that it is an instrument of the Communist Party, whereas the action and tactics of said teachers union over a substantial period of time have been and are calculated to cause discord and confusion, to impair public confidence in our schools, and to reflect discredit on the high professional and ethical standards of our teachers, and to interfere with the proper administration of this board. Now, there be it resolved that effective immediately, neither this board nor its supervisors or administrators shall negotiate, confer, or deal with or recognize the said teachers union or its agents or representatives in relation to any teacher grievances or any personal or professional problem, nor grant to said teachers union any of the rights or privileges accorded to any teacher organizations, provided, however, that this order shall not deprive any person of the opportunity to address a public meeting of this board in accordance with the rules and customs of the board, nor shall it affect the right or privilege of any individual employee to present through appropriate channels any personal grievance or problem. Very reasonable there. So this is now a video, as my last little video, and it describes kind of how people reacted to this when they were kind of forced out of profession they loved. I think it's important to note that the professionalism of the teachers who fell victim to the purge was really never in question. These were phenomenal teachers, oftentimes had taught for 20 years, had been instrumental in bringing things like Black History Week to their schools, had been, tirelessly fighting to improve education, and they were just kicked out onto the street.
At the very end of the interrogation with Moskov, he said, I direct you now to name, under the ruling of Dr. Jansen, to name the names of those people that you knew who were communists. And I said, I refuse to do that. Now, if you can tell me what laws these teachers broke, and if I agree that they broke these laws, I'll give you their names. And I sat, and I waited, and I waited, and there was silence. And then I said into the tape recorder, let the record show that Mr. Moskov is silent. There were no laws that these teachers broke. And I will not be an informer. And I held up my 10 fingers. And I said, I will earn a living with my 10 fingers. And someday, I said, justice will prevail.
Yeah, it's a very, I think, a very touching story, but also really sad. It's someone who really loves his job and is kind of forced to do like TV repair work and kind of forced out of public life. This is something that happened to my great grandparents. They were forced out of CUNY, although they said it was okay because the superintendent was very honorable when he did it. They just had a strange code, but it really does like make a whole stain on your life. I think one of my grandmother's like first memories was like going up to the attic because the FBI was like searching the house. It's just really affects people throughout their lives, and really affected the left in the U.S. Okay. So I'm just gonna like maybe kind of come back now that we have this full story. I just want to come back to this chapter we read, or hopefully some of us read, on the teacher union's work after the purge. And so this is like a moment where in the 50s, they're really reduced to not much, but they still have this really strong presence in the classrooms. And they decide to focus on fighting racism and fighting discrimination, really on this kind of grassroots, like militant direct action style. They make this incredible document, Bias and Prejudice in Our School System. It's about getting racist books out. And this is while this guy Timon is taking books out of the classroom. He bans The Nation. He bans a Gentleman's Agreement, if you've ever seen the movie. He bans like Grapes of Wrath, I think. Just kind of classic doofus book burning stuff. There's a song by Tom Paxton around this time that I think is really emblematic of this era, where they start to see education really be reshaped by this culture of McCarthyism. What did you learn in school today? So this effort really emphasizes that this isn't just a mere gesture. We don't just do Black History Week. We really want to incorporate this history and a new way of teaching history throughout the school system. They distribute it throughout the school system to trade unionists, to press, to civil rights group. They even publish a guide to research. They kind of trying to get teachers to start looking for these ideologically racist texts in their textbooks. They succeed in getting around 8 of the textbooks dropped. This is while the Board of Ed refuses to even acknowledge that they exist. So it shows their remaining organizational strength. And they really connect it to a campaign to actively teach Black history, including a campaign that brings in the recent research that was being done on Reconstruction, on slave rebellions by people affiliated with the Communist Party, and kind of they issue a pamphlet on the truths of Reconstruction at the time, when people were still teaching that Reconstruction was this kind of terrible time period. They published their own study guides on abolition. It really is, I think, reminiscent to work that teachers are still trying to do today to fight back against book banning, to fight back against cultural conservatism and the kind of white supremacy inherent in our educational system. They also fight to integrate the schools, and this is around the time starts to be the early 60s, where school integration becomes in the history of teacher unions in New York City a hot topic, but unlike in the late 60s, where there's this the teacher unions even kind of strike against this community trying to have some Black sovereignty and self-determination in education, here they really work to follow the lead of parents and civil rights groups, and really try and work together. They work together with someone named Milton Clamason, who was the kind of main person fighting for school integration in New York City, who was later really pitted against the U of T by the late 60s, just a few 5 years later. It really shows, I think, a kind of alternative path to how teacher unions could be and how public sector unions could act. I'll just skip this for time. Okay. Yeah, so here's this pamphlet they're putting out, and I think it just shows how they're thinking about their union. This is really different to how public sector unions talk about their main issues. So they say this union is engaged in a crucial fight for freedom and decency in public education. So it's defending 8 teachers in the political witch hunt. It fights bias and bigotry in textbooks, anti-Semitic, anti-Negro, and anti-foreign teaching. It fights militarization of schools. It also fights for educational budgets to provide good schools for the children and adequate salaries for teachers. It's interesting how that's the last clause there is, and adequate salaries for teachers. It's pretty much a polar opposite to how public sector unions often present themselves now. I mean, they might fight for kind of social justice means as a kind of secondary issue, but really it's primarily we're advocating for our members. But they were really advocating for the whole community, and I think that's an important innovation of theirs and something we can really take from. And this just shows all the publications they were putting out, academic freedom, what kind of school for your child, this thing on bias and prejudice, this teacher's bulletin. I like this test of a teacher: professional excellence or political conformity. It really shows their kind of broad focus. And I just want to briefly touch on this. I say briefly because there's basically no research out on this. The rest of the United Public Workers, they're also doing this too. They're expelled in the CIO in 1950 along with other left-led unions, but some of them survive. The Public Sector Worker Union in Hawaii is still called the UPWA. It just like the Board of Ed, there's this moment where the welfare department is also criminalized. That's one of the few other cases where it's been written about what happened in the Red Scare and public sector workplaces in New York City. And I want to just read a bit. It's like one paragraph is written about this, but there must be so much more, right? This social service union, it was the agency was really dedicated to stopping the political contestation of this space. So just look at what we lost here. The UPWA had begun to form alliances between welfare workers and recipients, kind of like a welfare rights movement. After the purge, the city imposed surprise night visits. They canceled Black History Week programs in welfare centers. Around 175 welfare employees were targeted. 172 of them were Black or Jewish. The president of the local, who was the only Black female local president of a union in the country, was dismissed and fired. And this guy who was in charge of it, Hilliard, he really broke the union and made it kind of complicit in policing and depoliticized welfare. It really is remarkable. You kind of get the union out of the way and suddenly they just remove like all rights you have if you're a recipient of welfare. So I'm just going to close with this moment of these left-led unions. They're expelled from the CIO for being too linked to the Communist Party. This is 1950, but they try and make it work for a few years. Some of them still exist to this day, the UE, the ILWU, but most of them die out. But in this time, they really dedicate themselves to fighting back against this tide of totalitarianism and de-emphasizing these kind of social things the CIO would fight for. They formed something called the NNLC. That's the National Negro Labor Council. This is in the context of a conservative shift in the labor movement. They fought to advance their interests using direct action tactics of the CIO's left unions. They form local NLCs that fight against hiring discrimination. They call it a kind of grassroots fair employment commission. All the records of this moment are destroyed in 1956 by Coleman Young, who later becomes mayor of Detroit, but was active in organizing sanitation workers. He says he did it to kind of protect the identities, but it really means we'll never know the full identity of the full extent of what happened here. But the official unions, like, they have this priority around this time of maybe, groups like the UAW are vocally supportive of civil rights, but the priority is really reducing conflicts in the name of institutional stability. So while they might support formal legislation, they were against the grassroots pressure needed to translate that into real gains. This really destroyed union democracy over the 40s and 50s. And I think oftentimes people who are affected by this said, look, we're fighting for a real democracy. And I think it's true that they really were fighting for a more democratic society. And I think this really lays it out, their kind of grassroots vision. It says cooperation, not permission. This is by the leader of UAW 600, where we ask for your cooperation, but we do not ask for your permission. We will fight for this. And many of these people become really active in the civil rights movement later. Some of the people organized around this time are Birmingham school teachers, and they become real key fighters in the fight for civil rights in Birmingham. There's people like Cleveland Robinson, who becomes the leader of District 65 and helps organize. I think he was like one of the main people helping organize the March on Washington. So there is this real link and power formed in this moment. So I just want to, maybe like close with that. There's this one, this guy, Morris Travis, with the eye patch there. This is what he gives a speech at it. He says it's a time for new John Browns, and it's this real, I think, interesting moment in American history where this large Italian guy with a giant eye patch can go off on stage and give this speech. So he says, I didn't come here to orate about the problems of African Americans and hand out a fancy custom built set of answers designed to wash away all problems like Walter Reuther would do later on. What I've got to say is aimed at the white trade unionists. So he stressed, I like it's a matter of cold self-interest, self-preservation of themselves and their unions for them to press that fight just as hard as they can. I've been trying to say that when white workers join in campaigns for the liberation of their fellow freedom fighters, the white workers are helping themselves. The white workers who are here at this conference have a special responsibility. They have the job of going back to their homes, to their unions, and campaigning for black-white unity. Not among the black members of the unions, but among the white workers. He finished by saying, this is a time for new John Browns to arise up and down the land. And I'm convinced that out of this conference will come a whole army of John Browns, men who are dedicated not to talk and double talk, but to action. Men of principle and of conscience who are convinced that Jim Crow can be licked. The time has come to lick it so that black people in the U.S. can take their full and rightful place as first-class citizens of this land with full social, economic, political, and civil rights. The time is ripe. Let's go. I think this is like something that I'll just like shout out a group I'm active in right now, very selfishly, Cityworkers for Palestine. And I think other people fighting for Palestine in our unions now. I think we're really taking on this vision of you can really build your union by fighting for Palestine. And I think the recent victory of the Starbucks workers does show that this was effective for them. I think this is like just like real important lessons to draw from. I have a whole lot of these are like all the documents I could find just like in an archive on this union, and I wanted to just like pass them around just to show like kind of how this union would portray itself internally. So this is their little gains worth keeping for and fighting for with UPW, just bragging about themselves. Even in this kind of thing, they'll say like in welfare, one of our main gains, we brought humane treatment in dealing with the unemployed. And we also won grievance procedures, and we helped raise standards for welfare throughout the nation. In education, we both fight the witch hunt, and we won up to $900 in raises. And we successfully ended double salary schedule in the South. And they fight. This is, I think, still a great message is the members run this union. And I think still today this is a key kind of point that people in the socialist movement fight for in our unions. They say UPW members decide UPW policies. They elect their own officers. They draw up their own demands. No wage settlement can be made without approval by the membership. It's a democratic rank and file union. Nothing is handed on a silver platter. No public official has ever willingly volunteered benefits to his employees. Every game made by UPW was fought for by united and determined membership. Recognition of union demands came only when the union demonstrated its strength and unity. Nowadays, my union kind of says, we got you these things and you can thank us for that. You didn't have anything to do with it. And then they yell at us for spreading lies about the union. So I think it's a really remarkable difference how these groups would portray themselves. So I want to just like, pass all of these out. I think especially here that this is the report of the New York City Joint Anti-Discrimination Committee of the United Public Workers, and just lists all their activities. I think it's really remarkable they're doing this while they're just kind of facing this existential threat for their lives and getting harassed by the cops every day, but still they would do things like go to picket lines every day. They would present classes on democracy in the U.S. It's really, I think, Yeah. So there's a lot of papers there. So I think just pass and just take a look. And I've got some discussion questions now. And maybe just while you're looking at these papers, I'd like to hear people's thoughts on this. Like, so is this just like a kind of like, is a real story of this kind of what could have been, and then, this union started acting really differently, and this is just a kind of missing link, or is it this living thread? Like, how much do we see a continuity through history of like maybe subterraneanly people fighting for these values versus like this was just kind of killed off in the 50s and, too bad. For those of you in unions, does this history speak to you? What possibilities does it bring up? And these teachers, they often talk a lot about fighting for a real democracy. They're really fighting for democratic vision. And they're really saying, look, the guys who are persecuting us, they're saying we're obeying this totalitarian state, but they support Jim Crow, they support racism, they support totalitarianism, and we're the ones who really support democracy. How do you talk about democracy in the workplace? What do you think they meant by that? And do you use kind of a framework like that when you talk politics? And finally, how do you balance practicing and doing politics in unions while maintaining a democratic culture? They had to struggle with like, okay, we're all communists and we want to, push for the party line, but we also want to run an effective union. And they were facing police repression anytime they mentioned the C word. And, they lost this fight, I would say, and it's a tough balance. How do you do it? I think it is important to note, though, out of all of this, that they, because I hear it all the time, is that they were absolutely great at these jobs. These were incredible teachers, just like, really heroes, and they were mercilessly kicked to the curb for like 30 years by New York City, including by the union movement. I think I hear a lot is, you just keep your nose down to the grindstone and work within the, and you'll kind of rise to the top. But, being really good at your job and being, really effective is not going to save you if the hammer is really going to come down, which is a really sad truth. But I think it's pretty clear from this.
How'd we get from this to Albert Shanker?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Sorry, I missed. So Albert Shanker, for those who don't know, is this kind of longtime head of the UFT, and I think later becomes president of the AFT. He was. I grew up with some people who cursed his name because of his
Cold War.
Yeah, Cold War, just total hack. In his dying breath, he was writing columns like decrying against. He was doing like culture war stuff by the 90s and writing, whining about political correctness, and really kind of sets the tone for the UFT and leads them in this really kind of hate strike in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, which is a very complicated subject we could spend many, I think, sessions on. Yeah. But so like around, like they emerge out of this teachers guild that's these kind of like people who leave the union in 1935, the old guard. They stick around in this thing called the teachers guild, and eventually they kind of kind of glom on to other people, and they start fighting for collective. They decide we're going to fight for collective bargaining rights if it kills us. This is going to be our only fight, our kind of leading focus. And it really does work. They lead a strike, which even the teachers union at the time says, this is like 1960, says, I don't think it's a good idea to strike. And they totally win. And I think maybe part of it is like the Board of Education decides, well, I'd rather bargain with these guys. But they really gain the popularity and trust of the teaching populace. And the teachers union, at its height, it was like 4,000 or 5,000 people. It was always really a minority union, and they're able to kind of fight to get a bargaining election where they win and become the sole bargainer and really crush both the NEA and the teachers union. And so they lose this representation vote, and the UFT becomes the sole representative of teachers. And at that point, the teachers union, this is 1964, basically, they vote to dissolve themselves and say, look, like the game's up. We basically can't really function anymore. And, you know, they were really, really weakened by the Cold War. And in their, you know, kind of final obituaries, they talk about how great they did and say, yeah, we kind of were pretty much killed in 1950 and then just hung on since then. You know, I think another thing that happens is that teachers start both politically separating themselves from the community, but also spatially separating themselves from the community. Like, this is 1950, right? They're going out to, you know, they're living in Levittown, they're living in out in Queens, you know, in Flushing, right? They just don't have the same relationship with the community that teachers might have had in the 40s and 50s. And I think that's like an important part of the story too, is they really just don't see themselves as kind of linked to the community, and in fact see themselves as pitted against them. And I think to this day, like I just heard another union meeting like last night, people were like, you know, my coworkers, I don't, you know, some of them, they're so wild, I don't know if they're clients or coworkers, in the sense of like being a client is a bad thing, right? So
Do you know about that commie cell in the school in Park Slope?
yeah.
Teachers out there. I haven't talked to her in a while, so I haven't got the latest. But it was Progressive Labor Party had a center to the
Yes.
girls volleyball team, but there was a teacher advisor also, and the UFT representative. I'm not sure what her title was exactly, but she was using some provision you mentioned, like the
Yes.
regulation or law, to try to get these people fired. You know,
Yeah.
the Cold War legislation.
Yeah. Yeah. This was in like 2018 or 2019
Yeah.
or so.
Yeah.
And yeah, they just use these same provisions of like, we have someone teaching communist subversion. Yeah. Some of this stuff is still on the books. Yeah. It was declared unconstitutional by the Warren Court in 1967. But it really took until 1980 until the city coughed up some like past due pensions to these people.
In that sort of like late 50s, 60s era, are there still like remnants of the old union that are like either fighting internally and
yeah, they exist till 1964, and they are like active and supportive of this guy I think is Glamison or something, but he leads in 1963. I think there's like this big school walkout and to protest segregation in New York City called Freedom Day, and they are like kind of supportive and active in this, but they really are just like 1,000 strong in this time. And yeah, there is a moment in this book where he interviews one of these teachers in 1987, and she's like, Shinker, I never would have gone out on strike with those people. Like, that was a total mistake. So they kind of keep there is some like opposition, and there is trade union opposition and even opposition within the UFT to the Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike. But you know, that's a longer story.
Is there any connection between the modern Chicago Teachers Union and this union, or is it just like something they spontaneously decided to do again?
So the question was about the Chicago Teachers Union. The caucus that like has political control of the Chicago Teachers Union right now actually did start as a reading group. Forget what book they read, but I think it was about something about the CIO. They weren't reading about Chicago schools, but I think they were inspired by this like vision. And they were like had a very political vision at the time. Yeah, there were a bunch of members of the ISO in that, and yeah, definitely were, I think, inspired by this history, although not this particular history.
Hey, so I have a sort of question of, what was sort of the makeup of the city public sector back then? Like, kind of like, what were the things that the public sector was actually doing beyond the sort of teachers and stuff? Just because I'm kind of curious, because like obviously over the next 100 or so years, the city's grown in ways, but also kind of shrunk in ways in terms of what the public sector does. So just kind of curious about what it was doing in the 30s.
That's a great question. I can't give like a thorough answer. I mean, at this time, I'll say like at this time, there's also the WPA, and that's like a big part. I was trying to look through some like old newspapers, like the old Daily Worker, and they would always mention like there's these WPA guys also working with us at the same time. So I know there is like federal investment happening, and maybe kind of the work. I'm not so. From my like, I think reading that, I would assume maybe the actual city workforce was smaller than in like the 50s, like real kind of height of New York's like Wagner Act, social democracy stuff. But that's a great question. it was like, the workforce, I think it's important to note, was a lot whiter back then. And there was still a lot of old patronage networks, and a lot of the, unions that existed around the time really were, like, I think really targeted. There was something called the Civil Service Forum that still exists today. And I know they're really old because they only represent like bookbinders and mortuary assistants. But they were around, and I think we're just kind of speaking for this like kind of professional class.
I was wondering, beginning you mentioned, this was like a broader question, but the sort of, I forget exactly how to describe it, but the wild, like from the 30s, the mass organization era?
Yeah, like mass action is how they call it. Yeah.
If you could just, I like know nothing about that. I was just curious if you could, like, an example. Or
It's a really interesting time period. It's like, that's like a whole, there'd be a long, there'd be like a really long answer there. I think the important thing to think about how the left is like approaching unions is it really changes throughout the 20s and 30s and 40s. And there is this time where they're like trying to like build these unions and often build them in like kind of alongside other people who aren't part of the same party or part of the same movement. Around the late 20s, that's when this kind of splits in the left start emerging. So the Lovestonites emerge. There's the Trotskyists, the Mustites. There's the old SPA. There's a bunch of different groups and a bunch of different things. And the Communist Party really has this emphasis on we're going to go it on our own and make our own unions. And oftentimes they really focus on people who they, other unions weren't focusing on because they needed to find their niche. So, unions at the time were very craft based. And so they're the ones who maybe go out and famously organize the unemployed, who other unions aren't organizing. They go into, I think, textile mills in the South, very famously in Elizabethton, I think, and organize there. So they really are trying this idea of organizing the unorganized. I think that's one of the legacies they take there, although a bunch of other people were doing it too. And then by the middle of the 30s, they merge these unions back into the AFL and then the CIO. But these are the people who are really experienced fighting these, oftentimes completely losing battles in these unions, became like they were really experienced organizers, and those were the ones who like kind of were brought in by the CIO to organize steelworkers. So there's this kind of legacy of organizers, less than a legacy of organization.
Isaac, I'm interested in your take on these questions here, and like your perspective on your union.
Yeah, she did ask that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the last one because it's like really hard, right? Because like, okay, I mean, I don't know to dox myself fully, but like, I'm one of like 3 stewards for, around like 500 people. We're basically like, the main frontline point of contact with the union. And I think there's a real balance of like, I just wrote my email on Monday, and I'm, part of the email is like, we're getting new dental insurance cards, everyone. And then I also like, I'm thinking like, how do I frame these issues? How do I use this email to talk about politics without being this kind of like email crank? Essentially, it's really tough. So I was really hoping people would give me some advice on that one, because I haven't totally figured it out yet. But I do think like Palestine has been a really, we have really managed to bring more people into union meetings, into like being active, into seeing unions as a place to do politics. Like I, brought forward a ceasefire resolution in my local, and it was the first time we had ever voted on anything that I remember. And I think that, a lot of people are like, what's happening? We're voting on something. What's going on right now? But I think really like people were like, the next day, like people were reaching out to me saying like, oh yeah, some people in my workplace were talking about this, and they're like, wait, unions can talk, like, why are we talking about this at a union? And people are starting arguing, can unions talk about politics? So I think that, you can find moments to kind of expand the vision of what a union can be. And that's what I try to do, very gingerly. Yeah. But I think democracy is a great way to talk about that. I really, I mean, it's, and I think they're totally right. Like they're people like saying like, we're really like these people are saying we're this threat to democracy, but we're really trying to build a real democratic culture here. And I think that's something that like is, a real like kind of like good way to talk about politics, I find. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this may be a little in the weeds, but I work for the Office of Labor Relations, who like for context, Office of Labor Relations is who public sector unions bargain with in New York City today, but that was not the case back then. So I was kind of a little curious, like you got a sense of like the relationship between like the mayor and who, I guess like basically who was representing the mayor, or was it the mayor themselves that were representing them when bargaining with these teachers?
Yeah, well, it's a board of ed,
Okay.
Which is at that time like appointed by the mayor, and yeah, I guess they definitely are. They're definitely lobbying the mayor. They're lobbying in Albany. They have like legislative affairs people. They have limited ability to. They don't have contracts, right, and they don't have collective bargaining really. But they collectively bargain, but they don't have these contracts. They're not like recognized in the same way that unions are now. So they're both like fighting, I think in Albany for things like, school size bills, which teacher unions still fight for. But they're also really taking on like projects in their own schools. A lot of times there's like dilapidated conditions, especially in schools in Harlem, and they form these like Harlem kind of neighborhood committees to like agitate for it. It seems like they're kind of like fighting against their targets are like the Board of Education and the mayor usually, and just fighting for more funding, and then it seems like they're maybe in the schools doing their grievances with like individual principals. But yeah, it's a totally different way than how grievances would be dealt with these days, where you have these like kind of whole step long processes. Yeah. I should say also take everything I said with a grain of salt, because there's really not much written on this. And, I'm very much not an academic, and this is my reading of the history, but it's something that like, I really would love to see more, writing on. And I think it is this like incredible, like hidden history. And I'm sure there's, I don't know, some archives in the Tamanent Library that have some of these papers out there.
Yes, this is from June Binney. What a great talk, Isaac. So fascinating, and reminds me of my mom, who was an ILGWU organizer and led protests against the impending execution of the Rosenbergs. In the 1960s and 70s, my dad couldn't get government security clearance since there was an FBI file on my mom. I also was in 6th grade during the teacher strike of 1968. And my mom used the moment to teach us about the labor movement. I went on to become Deputy Commissioner for Correctional Health and under Mayor Jenkins and Giuliani, and had 9 unions working in my workforce of 3,000 clinicians on Rikers Island, including the Doctors' Council. I have many complicated feelings about the evolution of unions based on my experience in the 1990s, especially with Norm Seabrook and the Correction Officers Union. You should be a professor of labor history. Talk to Steve Pryor and Cooney.
I'm happy at my job right now, but yeah.
I think we're at time, unless anyone else has any questions. Hey everybody, thanks for coming out to Poly Ed, and special thanks to Isaac. Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation, as June was celebrating. So we are New York City DSA citywide Poly Ed. If you're interested in getting involved, you can reach out to me or Isaac or any of the people who look like they're sort of running things. We have 3 more sessions left of Socialists of New York City. Come join us for new social movements, racial justice, and internationalism. Following that will be Crisis and Crackdown, about the fiscal crisis in New York City and welfare defunding. And then our final session will be, I think we're going to have like a barbecue or something, and we'll talk about everything from the 80s up to today, which includes us. So I hope you'll join us. And you can always go to, let's see, we have a new website. It's socialist.nyc/political-education. I think that's it. Oh, and we pass a hat, if you don't mind. Okay, everybody, good night. All right, we're going to Kiki's. Please join us.